Okay, so I know recently I've been praising movies far more so than burying them in their horrible plot, cast, writing, acting, camera work, Gerard, Butler, and whatnot, but I want to be very clear here, Isle of Dogs and Ready Player One were both really good movies. The latter of which I reviewed earlier this week, and yes, Isle of Dogs was an incredibly artful film with great writing and even better voice acting, but neither of those come close to A Quiet Place. A Quiet Place is directed by John Krasinski, who you all might know better for playing Jim Halpert on The Office for 8 years. I really liked him on The Office. I'm sure everyone did except for BuzzFeed. But while Jim was a good character and John did a good job, I'd never really thought about his acting skill, much less his directorial skill, even though he'd apparently directed 3 episodes of The Office and 2 other movies. Those 2 movies being The Haulers and Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. Both are comedies and both were given releases at film festivals, and weren't given wide releases, so for all intents and purposes, A Quiet Place is his first film in theaters. It's also the first film he's directed that wasn't a comedy. Instead, it's a horror, which is quite the jump in genre. Now, personally, I view the horror genre as having 2 main types of writing. Not every film fits the 2, but I'd say most typically do. The first is only made good by jump scares. Examples of that would be The Conjuring, The Cloverfield Paradox. It's not horrible, but the horror comes from the jump scare rather than the subject material. Whereas the second is story and suspense-based horror. They normally utilize jump scares, but it does so in a productive way that relates to the story most times instead of just trying to spook you randomly. Examples of this would be the original Cloverfield, Alien, and A Quiet Place. They focus more on the story, the theme, and what's going on to scare you rather than just throwing in enough jump scares and random killings to slap the horror label on it and call it a day. I think it's a big problem with the horror genre right now. Most movies go for shock value, whether it be ghosts, gore, or the inevitable plethora of jump scares. Less are focused on presenting a terrifying story or suspense-filled plot, although, if I have to be as technical as possible, the second type does fit more along the lines of the thriller genre, but I view the 2 as being synonymous with each other, since they basically are, most times. What I'm trying to say is this: most horror movies focus too much on scaring the audience just to scare them rather than building up suspense and horror. Instead, they just throw a ghost in your face 20 times and call it a day. The same goes for horror movies that call themselves horror just because they focus on subject material that is typically in horror movies. A Quiet Place is the perfect example of what I'm talking about, and considering it was a comedy writer's first horror film, not unlike Get Out, a popular horror film from last year, I was very impressed. I think this is definitely a contender in this year's Oscars, so when I say this is the best film of the year thus far, and it blows Isle of Dogs out of the water, trust me. A Quiet Place is a very intriguing concept. I won't reveal the entirety of it or spoil anything other than what the tagline for the film says. If they hear you, they hunt you. A very simple premise, but done incredibly well. The way the story is told reminds me a lot of how Baby Driver told its story. As much as music was a part of Baby Driver, silence was a part of this movie. From beginning to end, the entire story is conveyed through either subtitles for sign language or by newspaper headlines and words on a whiteboard. Films typically build up exposition by talking. Sometimes montages are used, but typically speaking, they rely heavily on spoken word. When a movie doesn't have that, you're required to explain the story in different ways that are most definitely more difficult but can yield a far higher payoff. And it's executed very well in A Quiet Place. The first 10 minutes of the movie has the best setup in any movie I've ever seen, and the entirety of it is silent. It sets it up so that whenever something does happen, you've already grown so used to the silence that the lack of it is terrifying. In general, casting is very important to a movie, but for A Quiet Place, it was essential. Everyone had to be able to convey a medley of emotions through their faces without speaking a single word. In my Tomb Raider review, I applauded Walton Goggins for his acting in it, and he really did an amazing job in Tomb Raider, but the entire cast for A Quiet Place had to do even more than Walton, and they all did. Even the child actors, which was particularly surprising, since typically no matter how good the movie is, any child actors in it have about as much talent as a bucket without a bottom. John Krasinski was not just the director, he also starred in it alongside his wife, and he was also the writer. He was phenomenal! I haven't seen any of his other movies, but going just off of the Office episodes he did direct, you wouldn't expect him to be able to execute something like this so well. Frankly, you wouldn't expect many directors to be able to pull off a movie like this that's shot this beautifully, silent throughout, and relies on such a small cast. As good as it was, I don't want a sequel. It's the best film I've seen all year, and one of the best I've ever seen in general. And it's the best made film I've ever seen, with the exception of Baby Driver, which I view as being on the same level as A Quiet Place. And considering A Quiet Place only had a runtime of an hour and a half, I urge you all to go see it, especially those that are horror buffs. A Quiet Place is an excellent new story and is packed full of emotional and real acting with amazing shots. I was absolutely blown away after I left the theater. I'd seen it was getting good reviews online, but I was not expecting such a stunning and fresh new film like this. And while I loved Isle of Dogs, it was great to see. It had a ton of character to it, and it had an incredible wit. A Quiet Place is just better. An easy 10. So yeah, if you're in the mood for a horror movie, a good movie, or anything to get your adrenaline pumping this weekend, go see A Quiet Place. Thank you everybody for watching, it means a lot to me, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and comment what movies or types of subjects you'd like to see me talk about next. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to turn on notifications, since YouTube's notification system is an absolute mess right now. If you want to see how I've rated and ranked all the movies I've seen, check out my IMDb list. It and links to my new song and my Patreon, if you'd like to help support the channel, are all in the description below. And as always, I'll see you in the next video. If you'd like to have your art featured in a video, draw me or one of my wondrous characters, such as the majestic Chad the Sad, and tweet it to @TahukanTV on Twitter. Huge thank you to Patreon supporters Anonymous and Matt Porter. I really appreciate it.